But our text today brings us to Genesis chapter 45. And I've entitled our study this morning, But God Sent Me. My mother is a retired math teacher. Living with a math teacher definitely has its pluses and minuses. One of the minuses is that you always feel like there's somebody smarter than you in the house. One of the pluses, I guess, is that you get to see some of the stupid answers that students give to math problems. Now, this is a trigonometry problem on the screen. I have no idea what the proper way to solve it is, but I know that you're not supposed to just slash through n so you end up with 6. That's not the way that's supposed to work. Math is a very unforgiving discipline, isn't it? There is really no subjectivity in outcomes. You cannot coax answers your way. You cannot make the numbers feel sympathy for you when you can't figure out what's going on. Now, there are many different variables that go into traditional mathematics, and we don't always know the right formulas that we need to use, but there are rules that govern the way these things are done. And that's a lot like life, isn't it? There is an operating principle that governs life, and we sometimes don't understand all the variables that are put against us, but we know that there is a plan behind it. In fact, in theology, we call it the sovereignty of God. God is the keeper of the formulas. And we know some of them, and some of them we don't. Even the formulas of chance, which are unknown to us, are really known to Him. I'm going to give you a math problem, and I might regret doing this, but there are some math problems where you always get the same answer. Now, you could pull out a calculator or use your phone if you want to do this. These are fascinating. There's a formula that always gives you the number 5. So think of a number, small number, 7, 9, 12, whatever. Take that number, add the next number to it. There's no quiz here. You'll not be held accountable for your answer. Then add 9 to it. All right? Then divide it by 2. And then subtract the number you started with. And it doesn't matter what you put in, you are always going to get 5. Always get 5. Some theologians have said that mathematics is a reflection of the sovereignty of God. That there are governing principles that replicate or mirror the fact that there is a being who governs all things. All of the variables, even all the unknown formulas. In the mind of God, there are certain outcomes. It's true in life, there are many variables that come at us unexpectedly, but there are outcomes that the Lord has ordained. And I think in the Old Testament, you'll hardly ever find a better example of that than the life of Joseph. A young man, a talented man, a favored man in his family who was betrayed by his brothers, sold off into slavery, had many ups and downs, years of downs, and in God's sovereignty is raised to a position of second in command in the empire of Egypt, there where he helps to preserve the people from a long famine. His brothers have been affected by that famine. And in the chapters before what we're going to read in a moment, they've come for help. They've come to buy food. And Joseph recognizes them. And they don't have a clue who he is. And he's uneasy about them, so he's testing them to find out if perhaps they've changed. And they've gone through test after test. And the last one in chapter 44 was, were they willing to stick their neck out for their youngest brother or just abandon him? And Judah was willing to stick his neck out. Now it's time for the big reveal. He's going to tell them twice in the verses we'll read in a moment, I am Joseph. Shocking reveal. And yet there's something even more profound that Joseph reveals to his brothers. It's a truth. A truth that in the midst of all of this mess, God was at work. God was performing His sovereign will. Joseph's big reveal to his brothers encourages us that God's sovereignty overrides our problems as He executes His plan. I'd like us to read chapter 45, verses 1 to 8. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood before him. And he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please, come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will provide for you, and there you are still 5 more years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have would be impoverished.'" What an amazing reveal this is. His big reveal to his brothers encourages us about God's sovereignty, that God's sovereignty overrides our problems. And when I say that, I don't mean it eliminates our problems, but it overrides our problems as he executes his plan. We're going to look today at just part of this touching family reunion in chapter 45. Last Sunday night, I surveyed all of this chapter, and in the coming weeks, we'll look at the chapters 46 and 47 on Sunday nights. But this morning, we're going to look more closely at verses 1 to 8 in this great reveal. Let me give you a brief preview of what we'll be looking at today. We'll see, firstly, the uncontrollable emotion that Joseph has in the first couple verses. We'll look at the shocking disclosure that he makes in verse 3. And most of our time we'll talk about the overriding principle of God's control over all in verses 4 through 8. Now let's come back to verses 1 and 2, where we read about the uncontrollable emotion of the man in control. This man in control, Joseph, who's been in charge of everything for many chapters, is about to lose it. He is failing to keep it all within, we read in verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before those who stood by him. The verses before this, beginning in chapter 44, verse 18 to the end of the chapter, is the longest speech in the book of Genesis. It's where Judah, the brother who had perhaps conspired the most against Joseph many years ago, is pleading with the man in control, to spare their youngest brother, Benjamin. Joseph had listened to that long plea, and it revealed that he had changed, that there had been some, to whatever degree, some work of grace in his life. They were not going to abandon Benjamin like they had abandoned Joseph 21 years before. And Joseph can no longer keep up the disguise. This is the third time in these stories that Joseph has struggled to keep his composure. When the brothers first came in chapter 42, he had to step aside for a moment. When he saw his youngest brother, Benjamin, his closest brother, he had to excuse himself for a moment, and then came back and controlled himself. And there'll be plenty more tears shed as the story unfolds. And as the book ends, Joseph will be in tears 2 more times. And yet, he's been the man in control. For the last 3 chapters, he's been governing Egypt and demanding answers from these men. But here, he can't control his emotion anymore. I can sympathize with Joseph wanting to have control and yet not being able to do it. As a preacher and a teacher, and as a public speaker of any sort, you learn to control your emotion and channel your emotion. And yet there are times when you can become overcome by the emotion of the moment. There have been a few moments, a few instances in my ministry where maybe not the text I was dealing with, but some issue that had come up in our church's life just gripped me and wilted me. And there's nothing wrong with that. We might even feel a desire to join in with the tears of Joseph and his brothers as we read this story. But he's failing to keep it within, so that means he needs to order everybody out. In the middle of verse 1, he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him, no man than his brothers, when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. I think he banishes everybody out for a couple reasons. One is that it just doesn't look good for a royal figure to be wilting in front of everybody. But more importantly is that he wants to have a time of full disclosure with his brothers. With nobody else there, he can speak to them in Hebrew for the first time instead of Egyptian. All of the chapters doesn't disclose it, but we could assume that all these previous chapters, he's been talking in Egyptian with the translator, perpetuating this myth of him as the man who doesn't know who they are. But now, no translators, he's going to speak in his native tongue. And with no one else there, he can speak freely, and they can speak freely with him. Moses adds an interesting touch here in verse 1 when it says very simply, he made himself known to his brothers. Now you might think, well, that's not that big of a deal. But in the previous chapters, particularly chapters 43 and 44, as Moses has told the story, he's referred to Joseph by name, but he calls these guys the men. Because as far as they know, they're just a bunch of men before him. But now, after calling them the men 10 times in the previous 2 chapters, now they're always the brothers, the brothers, the brothers. 8 times in this chapter, they're the brothers. The brothers are back together again. Joseph is not ashamed to identify with them. He's like Moses later on, who is not ashamed to identify with his people and, if need be, even forsake the riches of Egypt. He's not abandoned, Joseph has. He's not abandoned God's plan for his people. Yes, his brothers did him bad, and it had been a long, long time since he'd had any contact with them. But we learned that Joseph is still keeping alive in his heart the promised plan of God that had been revealed to his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, Abraham. He'd not turned away from that. The riches of Egypt were great, and it was wonderful elevation, but that was no match for the plan that the Lord had begun. His brothers were, in a sense, the people of God. Pretty lousy bunch they were, weren't they, earlier on? But Joseph didn't let his disappointment with the people to stretch over to his disappointment with God. He held on to God even when God's people were not doing what they ought to do. He stayed active in the plan of God, even when others of God's people were not the way they ought to be. That's a wonderful example for us. Because within the church, within any church, you're going to have people of different maturity levels, some even who don't truly know the Lord, and they will do things and say things that will disappoint you and even hurt you. And I'm not saying that you just stick out your chin and take every blow that comes and do nothing to bring any protection, but don't let the abuses or the excuses or the failures of God's people turn you away from the greater plan of God. Because we even see in this story that these brothers who were so bad so long ago had begun to change. Grace has a great effect over time. He's ordered everyone out so he can reunite with them. And yet, he's failing to keep it all secret because we read in verse 2 that he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. They didn't see it, but they heard it. And the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Literally, and the house of Pharaoh heard. It could well be that Joseph's house was right next to Pharaoh's house. It could be that kind of setup. These are official grounds where he lives. It's very possible that through the windows and the doors they heard all of this commotion. So loud was it that the sound couldn't be muffled. I can't imagine how many ears there were pressed up against doors and windows, trying to figure out what was going on. In Egyptian literature, wise men were supposedly praised for being calm and in control. Joseph is a wise man. He's the greatest of the wise men that there are in Egypt. He was able to figure out Pharaoh's dreams by God's revelation. He was able to unravel all of that when nobody else could. And yet here's the greatest wise man of Egypt who's overcome. And yet, as Bruce Waltke says, in reality, he's giving expression to a higher wisdom in this authentic passion that he reveals. There's the uncontrollable emotion of this man in control. We look now briefly at verse 3 at the shocking disclosure of Joseph to his brothers. What we find Joseph doing in verse 3 is sharing and caring. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." And look at the very next thing he says. "Is my father still alive?" It's amazing that the first concern he has is not about him and what they think of him, but his father. In fact, the last thing that Judah had said to him was about their father. I want you to glance back in chapter 44, verses 33 to 34, where Judah is finishing his plea. Please don't keep Benjamin here as a slave. Take me instead. If you keep him, it's going to kill our father. Chapter 44, verse 33. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me? For fear that I see the evil that would overtake my father. The last word they had said to him was about my father. And the first thing Joseph says to them is, "How is my father?" And at the end of this speech, the last thing he brings up is his father. Joseph is not fixated here on justice, certainly not on revenge for all of the things that he has suffered because of his brothers. He's finding a common concern that they have. Joseph highlights something that they both care about. And I don't think that he's asking so much, is my father in the grave or is he still physically alive? But is asking more about his vitality. How is he? Is he near death? Is he healthy? Is he well? Will we be able to see him again? The famine from the weather and the fatigue from all of this worry may have been too much for him. And Joseph is concerned. Sharing and caring, but notice the result. His sharing leads to scaring in the second half of the verse. But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. They are in utter shock, disbelief. Actually, the Hebrew term is terrified. A word used to describe what happens when people see the scenes of war and disaster. Imagine in that moment, the years of guilt and grief that are sweeping over them. We know from the previous chapters that it's been on their mind. And the troubles they've been having through Joseph's test, they've been thinking, this is God reckoning with us for what we did to our brother. But Joseph is going to quickly move to give them assurances, not only about his own identity and his feelings towards them, but more importantly, about God's plan. And so we come to verses 4 through 8, which teach about the overriding principle of God's control over all. It starts with personal assurances in verses 4 and 5. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please, come closer to me." And they came closer. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Come closer," he says. Throughout the book, they've been given permission to come close and to draw near. In the last chapter, Judah stepped out from the other 10 brothers and drew closer to plead. And now Joseph calls them all, "Come even closer." He's inviting them into not just an audience, but a reunion. And he tells them again that they, in fact, heard him right. I am Joseph. I'm your brother, in case you think there's some other Joseph that this could be. And the thought, the feeling they must have, it must be like they've just watched a resurrection. Because as far as they knew, he was dead. He was certainly dead to them. They told their father he was dead. That was a lie. And everyone knows why they'd felt this way, because they had done him dirty. You sold me here. It's true. And yet, as Joseph says that, there's not a bit of, I'm rubbing your face all over this now because of what you did, you dirty rats. Joseph doesn't bring it up to convict them. He brings it up to convince them that he is, in fact, their long-lost brother. They knew the details, and he knew the details. And look at the assurance he gives in verse 5. Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. He's quickly telling them, I'm not out for revenge. I'm not even about demanding justice. What he wants is reunion. Don't be grieved. Literally, do not let it flare up in your eyes. An expression that refers to intense emotion, here mixed with anguish and rage and guilt. That doesn't mean that what they did was okay. It's not like, well, that was fine, I didn't mind. No, it was bad. It was awful. It was sinful. It was a violation of the will of God. And yet, interestingly, in another way, it was part of the will of God. It was a violation of the moral will of God, and yet it fit into the sovereign plan of God. Yes, there was need for them to be repentant, and I think Joseph has seen the penitence of their heart, the sadness that they feel over their sin. He mentions several times in his speech to them this place, he calls it here. You sold me here. Geography in the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their boys is an important part. You know, there's a lot of real estate changes. Abraham is way up in the northeast, and he moves down into Canaan, and then then Isaac lives there, and of course you have. For a time, Jacob goes back home, and then he comes back, and now his son Joseph is down in Egypt, out of the promised land. But God was at work even here. God was at work with Jacob even up there. We may get out of place from what we think is God's central plan, but God is at work. This land of Egypt was far from the promised land, but God's promises work wherever His providence takes us. Sometimes we get derailed in life, and circumstances make us move to places we never would have imagined, and we feel like this isn't the way it's ought to be, but you know what? God has not abandoned His sovereign plan for you. He's not abandoned His purposes for you in Jesus Christ. God is at work wherever His sovereignty takes us. After giving these personal assurances, he gets into a theology lesson. He talks about God's greater purposes in all of this affair. And the first purpose was to preserve their lives. Verse 5 again reads, Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Two striking things. One is, God sent me. Now, in the story in chapter 37, they sent him, and the Midianites sent him, and the other slave traders sent him. But they're not the only ones who sent him. God sent him in His sovereignty. That's the first ironic thing. The second ironic thing is God sent me here to preserve life. What's ironic is they sold him off to Egypt to be done with his life. How wonderful it is that we have a God who His intentions trump that of a sinful world. The world may wish things against us for evil, but God is able to work it together for good. And Joseph was indeed preserving life, wasn't he? God had given dreams to Pharaoh that no one could interpret, and Joseph could, though, and revealed that there were coming 7 years of great agricultural bonus, followed by 7 years of famine like they'd never seen before. And so he is raised up into a position of leadership to prepare the realm for this time of great scarcity. How many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives were saved because Joseph was placed where he was by God's grace, including his own family who were even outside of the land? Joseph is kind of like another Noah. God raised up Noah to preserve life in a time of judgment. And in fact, even this phrase of preserving life is used in Genesis 6, 19 to 20. And Joseph is now raised up, not with an ark, but with a plan to preserve life. When did all of this become clear to Joseph? When did it make sense to him that this was part of God's plan, him coming there? I would suppose that it came clear to him bit by bit, not all at once. I'm sure a large part of it became clear when the Lord gave him the wisdom to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, and he's then elevated into a place where he can spare life. But then even a year or two into that, when his brothers show up, and they're suffering under the famine, I suppose after the initial shock and the worry and wonder what was taking place, he began to see the hand of God in all of that. He wasn't entirely sure. That's why he tests his brothers. Have they changed? Are they in line with the promised plan of God? And seeing that they have, I think now in this moment, he can see very clearly what the Lord has done. John Sailhammer, biblical scholar, says that Joseph, who could discern the divine plan in the dreams of Pharaoh, also knew the divine plan in the affairs of his brothers. Through it all, he saw God's plan to accomplish a great deliverance, as he says in verse 7. So it turns out that this whole saga that he's been through, he being imprisoned and then rising up within the being enslaved and then rising up within the ranks of slavery, only to be falsely accused and then imprisoned and then be raised up again, all of this was due ultimately not to man's hate. Ultimately, all of this happened because of God's love. God's love sent Joseph into Egypt so that Joseph could preserve life. And not just life in general, though he did, but even more specifically, the life of his beloved family, the family that would become beloved, that is. God's love is able to triumph even the worst forms of hate. And there is no greater example of that in our Bibles than our Lord Jesus. Despised and rejected of men, made a curse, suffered and died at the hands of sinners, and yet sent because God so loved the world. And what Jesus did, not what was done to Jesus, but what Jesus did in his passion and his suffering, brought atonement and everlasting life to all who would believe. God's love is able to triumph over the worst forms of hate. And you know, he is at work in our trials and our troubles too. Some of the trials and troubles we face are impersonal things, that just affairs that happen, that there's no malice intended. It's just part of living in a crooked, broken world. And then there are things that happen to us by people with bad intention and harm. It may not even be that they hate us particularly. We might just be in the way of their lust and their desire to have and to steal and whatever. But understanding the sovereignty of God helps us put all of that into perspective. Alan Ross says, if it was not God who was at work, then Joseph might feel free to fix blame on them. But the one who is spiritual can perceive the hand of God in every event, and therefore is able to forgive those who wrong him. It's essential that people who serve the Lord cultivate a healthy understanding and application of the sovereignty of God, end quote. That's right. Now, there are unhealthy understandings of the sovereignty of God. There are ways to emphasize it in such a way that it puts everything else out of balance. But that doesn't mean we dismiss, move away from this. Well, this is a people have gone to seed with this. No. There is a healthy, mature way to understand and appreciate the sovereignty of God, and it is a key mark of growing as a disciple of Jesus. The sovereignty of God is what brought Jesus to the cross, and it's the thing that's going to lead us home to glory. Joseph goes on in verse 6 to talk about how their lives still need protection. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. His brothers knew how bad the first 2 years had been. That's what brought them to Egypt to begin with. And they were probably getting to a point that they were running out of money to be able to do it. They had no idea this was going to go on and on and on and on and on. They had no idea that farmers would even just give up trying to plant and harvest. There will be no plowing or harvesting. The famine would outlast Jacob's family's money, their ability to buy and trade grain. If it had not been for God's intervention, they would be doomed. There are a lot of things in the life of Abraham's descendants that almost brought them to an end. A lot of times it was their own foolishness. And this time it's a sovereign circumstance that there was not a thing they could do about it. But there was all kinds of things that God could do. And he did it in the most unexpected way. God wasn't just keeping them alive by Joseph's through Joseph's story. God was also keeping alive the promise that he had made. Verses 7 and 8 tell us that another of God's greater purposes was to preserve the promise. The promise made to Abraham many, many decades before, that he would take him and make him into a great nation. And through him, all the nations of the world would be blessed. Look how Joseph puts it here in verse 7. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. I don't know if you recall, but before Joseph was imprisoned, what led to that was his father sent him on a mission. The other brothers were up in Dothan, and Jacob sends Joseph, go check on your brothers. And of course, the brothers interpret that as check on us, means tell us what to do. So Joseph is on a mission, and he gets decommissioned. He gets enslaved and sent to Egypt. And yet, actually, God was sending him much further. God was still with him. This is, by the way, in these verses, the first reference in the Bible, the explicit reference to God sending someone. And it is a theme that will flow through the rest of the Bible. We'll be told that Moses was sent by God in Exodus 3:10. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. It'll be used of the prophets again and again, how 2 Chronicles 24:19 recounts the prophetic ministry. He sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Lord. He sent many different characters. He sent kings and priests and prophets, and of course, ultimately, you know where this is going. He sent his Son. As Jesus tells it in the story, in the parable in Luke 20, verse 13, I will send my beloved Son. And so he did. The rest of the Bible is packed with God sending people on his mission. Our life as believers in Jesus is built around the fact that God sent his Son to us and for us. Our life as believers in Jesus is also centered around the fact that God sovereignly sends us out to make known the good news of Christ. That there is, in fact, a sovereign saving plan to bring people to himself, to bring blessing to all the world, and it's through Abraham's greatest descendant, Jesus Christ. God sends. God sent Joseph. God sent Jesus. God sends you and me. All part of his great plan. Joseph says, now, he sent me to preserve you as a remnant in the earth, a rare Hebrew phrase that's used to describe people who have survived distress and disasters. It's used in the prophets to describe how God was going to judge Israel and diminish them, but there would be a remnant, there would be a core, a kernel of survivors who God would use to then bring into a time of great blessing and salvation. Here, the nation hasn't even gotten started. Here, it's a bunch of brothers and their wives and their kids. It's like the nation is in embryo form, and it's potentially going to die. But God preserves them as a remnant. If they were to have perished, then God's promised plan would have perished. God is keeping His promise. If the descendants of Jacob failed to survive, Kenneth Matthews says, then the whole of all humanity would die without salvation hope, because it was through their descendants that the plan would reach its apex in Jesus the Christ. But no, that's not the way it's going to happen. There's going to be, as Joseph says, great deliverance, a term that refers to something supernatural. The family had survived many things, but this one was too big for them, but it wasn't too big for God. That's good news, isn't it? There are things that come up against us that are just too big for us. They really are. They're never too big for God. He's greater, and He's there. Joseph continues in verse 8. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Third time he said this now. Now, of course, they did send him there, didn't they? Yes, they did, but he's making the point. The one who ultimately sent me here was God, and He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Joseph, again, he said that 3 times, God sent me. He's going to say it famously again at the end of the book of Genesis, chapter 50, verse 20. God sent me. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God did it. Now you did it too, but ultimately, He did it. And again, that doesn't mean it was okay, that it was morally right for them to trash Him as they did. It wasn't God's moral will for them to betray Him and lie to their father. And yet it was all within God's sovereign decree. God's sovereignty puts within context our sense of justice and injustice. God's able to bring about greater good through our troubles than we could ever imagine. Joseph explains what God had done in elevating him. He had made him a father to Pharaoh, a phrase that means he's an advisor to Pharaoh. Just as a father would give counsel to his adult son, so also Joseph is doing that with Pharaoh. He's Lord of all his household. That means he's the most trusted administrator of the affairs of state and finance. Ruler over all the land of Egypt, as the previous chapters reveal, he's second in command of the empire. Wow, what grace. Ruler, he says, which had to have struck a little chord in his brother's memory. Did you remember that first dream that's recorded that Joseph had back in chapter 37? A couple dreams, actually. That's rightly interpreted that his brothers are going to bow before him, and they say, "Are you going to rule over us?" And they couldn't bring themselves to even entertain that idea, and yet here they are. God did it. Joseph didn't make it happen. Joseph didn't climb the ladder of ego to get there. No, God did it. That dream wasn't born out of his pride. It was part of the plan. It is amazing that Joseph doesn't bring that up till the very end. His focus is on what God is doing, not what he himself is doing. He said much more about God in these verses than about himself. And you know, that is a mark of a mature understanding of the sovereignty of God. Where God is big and you are small. Amen. And if when you're talking about and thinking about and teaching about the sovereignty of God, you are big, then your understanding of sovereignty is out of whack. God is big. This reveal to his brothers, this big reveal, reveals something greater, doesn't it? It encourages us that God's sovereignty overrides our problems as he executes his plan. This is the first detailed discussion of the sovereignty of God in the Bible. God has certainly been sovereignly at work prior to this, but this is the first time it's really discussed. It involves the sordid, sad tale of a family that was at each other's throats, that was falling apart, and how God worked all things together for good to accomplish the purposes that he had promised. It's the first time the Bible brings this up, but it's certainly not the last time we'll see the hand of God in the pages of Scripture. And it's not even the most important example of it in the Bible. This theme reaches its highest expression, of course, in our Lord Jesus. Jesus, who suffered horribly at the hands of sinful men, much more horribly than Joseph did. Jesus, who accomplished a greater deliverance even than mighty Joseph did. It was all part of the plan. After a message like this, I hope that two things will be true. Firstly, that you will trust God's sovereignty can overcome all the worst things that you know about in your life for his glory and for your good. And secondly, that you will trust or continue to trust the Son of God who was sent to suffer at the hands of sinners for our salvation. As we prepare for the Lord's table this morning, how the Lord sent someone to do his work, let us think about the ultimate example of it, which was Jesus. Peter, at the day of Pentecost, is preaching to the Jewish nation there in Jerusalem. And he says to them in Acts 2, verse 22 to 24, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up. Again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. You did it, but God did it. God was at work to do something greater and better, to bring about everlasting life to all who would believe. Thank God we have a Lord with a sovereign plan that includes us, believers in this Messiah, and for all who will call upon the name of the Lord. Thank God we have this God at work in our lives. Dear Lord, we are thankful that you are the sovereign King over all things. There's not a thing in this world that is outside your control. Though demons and men rage against us, we know that it's all part of the plan. And with but a word, you can bring it to an end. That you have a plan to weave together all these things into the tapestry of your good purposes. And so remind us that, as Paul said, all things work together for good to those who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. Remind us of your Son, who suffered so awfully, and yet who suffered according to plan. And so in our distresses and our troubles, may we remember that you are not forsaken, and that you have determined not to waste one trial, but to bring about all that you've purposed. We pray it all in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.